Have you ever felt as if you weren't good enough? As if you were a failure? As if you were a fraud? As if you were an imposter?
I never really know what's going on. Look at me sometimes like all you want to do is run. Hear me out, hear me out.
Learning a new language is always a challenge. It is a journey at some points of which we can feel anxious, uneasy, vulnerable. Some people are hesitant to even embark on this new adventure. Others stop in fear once they compare themselves to those who are better, but most people find it hardest to speak or write, especially when they are to be assessed, especially when they are to face a native speaker, someone who can tell they're simply pretending to know the language they're clearly bad at. This can happen to the best of us. Why? Well, because there's something lurking in the shadows of our mind, ready to strike, ready to bite into our confidence. And this something is the imposter syndrome.
Well, psychologists prefer to speak about imposter phenomenon. The problem with the term imposter syndrome is that it attributes the feeling only to the level of the individual, and it sort of perpetuates victim blaming.
The word impostor itself comes from late Latin through French, meaning a cheat or deceiver. It first appeared in the English language at the end of the 16th century. Some 40 years later, it developed another shade of meaning, specifically denoting someone who passes themselves off as someone else. The word might make your hair curl if you happen to be self-conscious about spelling. In fact, right now we have two versions of it. The original one with an O, and the seemingly more prevalent one with an E.
The Toastmaster gives a glowing account of Fred's experience as a traveler and of his upstanding qualities as a man. He mentions how Fred is considered a leader of the community and how proud he is to introduce him. But look at Fred. He's not even sure he can stand up, let alone walk to the rostrum. He's trembling and weak in every joint. His feet are cold. His hands are hot and shaky. And Fred wishes he were someplace else.
The concept of imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon was first introduced by psychologists Pauline Clance and her colleague Suzanne Imes in a 1978 article tackling the question of specific feelings experienced by high-achieving women. Their research showed that women who excelled both academically and professionally somehow still doubted their own achievements, attributed them to pure chance, and displayed signs of depression, frustration, and even guilt.
In research studies, one study by Coakley and his colleagues done in 2013, they found that Asian Americans, compared to other racial groups, have higher levels of imposter syndrome. So I think that could be related to the family, could relate it to higher maladaptive perfectionism. Maladaptive perfectionism is the perfectionism part that often focuses on their imperfection. They magnify their imperfection and they're never satisfied.
It has become evident, however, that anyone can experience these highly unpleasant feelings and find themselves compulsively doubting their own success.
Women and groups that are discriminated against are more vulnerable towards this, but men also experience imposter syndrome. It has earlier roots as well in that adolescence where you feel like, you constantly feel like you are inadequate in every sense. Your body is inadequate, what you say is inadequate, what you feel is inadequate, everyone's judging you, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's sort of one of the problems that teenagers and children could face. The research shows that around 70% of people experience it at some point in their life in this or that area, because sometimes people can feel like imposters in one area and feel confident and competent in other areas.
The APA Dictionary of Psychology defines imposter phenomenon as a situation in which highly accomplished, successful individuals paradoxically believe they are frauds who ultimately will fail and be unmasked as incompetent.
Imposter syndrome, based on its name, it's usually focused on high achievers. And these high achieving people feel like they're an imposter, like a fraud. They're not real. And they're unable to internalize the success and achievement that they've accomplished. And in other words, usually these people are competent and highly qualified, but they just feel like they are not good enough. They have intellectual self-doubt. And then there's a strong fear that others will eventually discover them as an imposter. It's kind of like, I don't know, the parable of the emperor's clothes, that others looking at them and knowing all their weaknesses. So they tend to be very worried about being blindsided by their own weaknesses.
In a nutshell, imposter syndrome is this feeling of inadequacy, of not having earned what you have earned, your position in life, your success, your achievements. You feel like you haven't deserved them. They were the result of luck. On the level of the individual feels inadequate, feels the shame that they may be found out at any moment for being a fraud and a phony. But there's more to it than that, of course.
Again, I think that a lot of people with imposter syndrome expect to kind of reach perfection overnight. And the funny thing is that even if you're in the classroom or a kind of environment where you're speaking English, many people are so conscious about what others think about them.
So imposter syndrome folks often tend to focus on meeting external expectations, meeting others people's expectations. And sometimes they might not really know what they want, who they are, and they might feel empty in the inside as they focus on outside presentation. And as I mentioned, there's an inner critic inside of them that magnifies the imperfections, magnifies the weaknesses, and so they feel like they're a fraud.
It's indisputable that doubt can penetrate virtually any aspect of our life. So it would only be fair to assume that language learning is one of the spheres influenced by the imposter phenomenon. It seems possible that many people don't feel confident enough to challenge themselves to read authentic literature, watch films without subtitles, write complex texts, and especially speak in their target language. You might have already faced the so-called language barrier that seemed impossible to overcome, the imposter syndrome being one of the factors playing into its creation. In this documentary, we are concentrating on ESL, learning and teaching English as a second language. Nonetheless, you should bear in mind that all we say is true about any language whatsoever.
People may feel like imposters when trying to speak, for example. They may not feel like imposters while learning a language because, well, they sort of have this license to make mistakes, to try to learn. But when they try to apply the language, they may feel like an imposter. When they try to speak to, I don't know, a real native speaker person, then, well, who am I to use the English language? I'm not competent enough. I'm not good enough. My pronunciation is not good enough, for example.
I think it affects everything across the board, but I would agree with you where speaking is just out there in front a bit more because you're having to perform directly in front of someone. Everything else can be done within the confines of your own comfort zone, like writing and listening and reading, but speaking, which involves communication where you feel you're going to be judged based on your skills, people tend to retreat into their own little shells for fear of making mistakes and ultimately looking bad, like a sense of rejection if someone picks up on a mistake. So it's better just not to speak.
Well, again, if you don't have very bad luck of meeting a native speaker or any speaker of this language who are going to be, I don't know, unfriendly or, well, I can't even imagine that because naturally people are very friendly if you try to speak their language and people are usually supportive. And we know that all the time when you just say, good morning, hello in, I don't know, in French or Spanish, people usually reckon, oh, your Spanish is so good. So it's just about just starting, overcoming your shyness and just talk. Yeah. And it's just practice, actually.
I think we talk about language learning, especially learning a new language. I think it's embarking something new. And so if you've learned a new language before, you know that you're often conscious about what you're saying. Is it grammatically correct? How does my accent sound? How does people perceive me? And because of this consciousness about performance, it's related to imposter syndrome. People who have imposter syndrome magnifies the normal consciousness about their performance. And also, when you're learning a new language, you're likely to make mistakes. And if you magnify those mistakes, you'll feel bad about yourself. So people learning a new language, they can become more apprehensive in terms of communicating with others or being afraid of making mistakes. And when that intersects with language learning, it can become a barrier, because the more the fear of making mistakes will hold you back from communicating and practicing with others.
This language does not reflect who you are. You feel like an imposter. It's very easy to feel like an imposter when trying to speak another language, because you cannot say everything that you want to say in a way that you want to say it.
I do research on international students, and what I think is really important is to acknowledge that there's a loss when you go from one culture to another. And then the loss leads to the need to relearn and redevelop and grow. So if you're in one culture, you feel like, oh, you're very confident in everything. And but you go to a different culture, you feel like you're an elementary school student. You have to ask a lot of questions. A lot of things take a lot of time, and communicating is so hard and frustrating, and you're not as eloquent as in your native language. Same with speaking in a different language.
Being a good teacher quite often requires being a good psychologist as well. An experienced teacher will always notice their students' mood, see changes in their disposition, and pay attention to their insecurities. So, manifestations of the imposter syndrome won't slip through.
I have a speaking club at the moment, and I get messages from quite a few students who join, especially new ones, and they say, oh, this person is so much better than me, I can't cope. Well, they've already been with me for several speaking clubs, and I know them, I've known them for several years. You're brand new. That's normal. It's kind of normal to be nervous. The lack of confidence is just clear. It's clear as day. I have to sort of nurture them to get them to speak. You can sort of detect this kind of fear that they would rather sort of maybe not try or keep themselves at a particular level than push themselves to something higher, but including mistakes.
But anyway, so very often people lack confidence. And this is because, first of all, they think that they are somehow kind of inadequate for the course. Yeah. So when we interview people, when we accept people in the course, they say, oh, I can't believe you're taking me. I thought I'm such a low level, whatever, but you think that I'm advanced, I can do this course, and so on. They think that all the other people in their group, they are much better than them. And this is kind of a saying in our school that, oh, I'm the weakest in my group. Like everybody thinks that they are the weakest in their groups. But again, I wouldn't call it imposter syndrome. I would call it just natural lack of confidence, because usually people tend to think that, well, other people, when they come to this kind of advanced environment, that everybody knows more than them, everybody speaks English better than them, and so on and so forth.
Imposter syndrome is closely related to perfectionism. If you're a perfectionist, you believe that everything you do needs to be absolutely flawless. So in order to speak a foreign language, you have to be immaculate at it. You got to sound native and have perfect grammar. And once you start speaking and obviously making mistakes, you get petrified and you don't want to keep going.
I think perfectionism has a relationship with imposter syndrome from different ways. I think in my research, we not only look at individual perfectionism, but we also look at family perfectionism. And so I think a family can have an impact on a person's imposter syndrome. So for example, if a family often overpraises someone, they might not feel like the praises or the comments are genuine, and it might develop distrust towards others' feedback. Or if a family often criticizes a child, they might grow up to develop an inner critic that's often focused on their deficiencies, and that's also a key aspect of imposter syndrome.
That's another thing about Russia. There is a massive degree of perfectionism in this country. That's the opposite. Either, like I said earlier, I've got to get it spot on, I've got to do it perfectly, or I'm worthless, which is the classic sign of a perfectionist. They just seem to retreat a lot. They would, even if they felt that they couldn't do a particular thing, then they might not just attend the lesson even.
There's no conclusive research on whether or not the imposter syndrome in language learning is more prevalent in some cultures than the others. However, judging from purely empirical observations, it seems to be the case. For example, Russia and China are susceptible to this phenomenon. Same goes for other countries with a history of strict educational system that views mistakes as something unwanted and undeniably bad.
So these are pure speculations. And just some observations of different cultures and stuff. So I think imposter syndrome can be more prevalent among cultures that focus more on criticism or self-improvement. I think there are cultures that focus more on self-enhancement. They focus on your strengths. They want you to feel good about yourself. But there's other cultures that focus on identifying strengths and get better. You need to improve. And so I think from my experience in my Taiwanese Asian education background, we often focus on where we're not good at. Like, okay, if we have a test, we scored 95 points. We're focused on the 5 points and then like, oh, this is where you need to improve. And the 95 that you got right, they're not acknowledged. They're just taken for granted. And I think so there's that kind of emphasis, especially through the education, on perfection or getting better or highlighting imperfection.
Yeah, first of all, I've been teaching in Russia for almost 17 years, a long time. And I just thought initially it was just the case of a lack of confidence among some students. But then I realized it's really deep rooted, it's extremely widespread, because it's not just where, like, just say 10% of students have it. You're talking about a good 80%. It's a huge number. And especially I work with teachers mainly, and in teachers included actually suffer from imposter syndrome on a very, very large scale. I do have some sort of ideas because I've been around Russia quite a lot, visited many schools, many institutions, and I've even written a book, which I haven't published yet, which kind of covers this as well. Mm-hmm. And I think in Russia, there's this, I don't know where it initially comes from. Maybe something to do with the Soviet Union or whatever.
From my experience, it does seem like this. I'd say because of the culture of teaching that we all experience, that goes back to the Soviet times and so on and so forth, there's externally induced shame that is manifested in language learning as well as other spheres, I'd say.
There's a huge emphasis to kind of get straight fives. You know, there's just this massive emphasis, even among parents. Now, some people will say, well, it's okay if my child gets a 4, but I still know among many children, including my elder daughter, you know, that there's just this feeling that if you don't get a 5, you're then somehow completely worthless. And there's a big problem with this, because actually 5s are given out quite a lot in many places. It kind of devalues that top mark as well. And so, therefore, what is the sort of prescribed top level that you're going to aim for if that top mark is devalued? Like in England, for example, no, we do get sort of good marks as well, but we tend to give more marks like B's and C's and not just A's, because A's are reserved for the absolute best of the best of the best.
And when you are constantly criticized in class, it's very easy to feel like you're constantly not doing well enough. And if you try to apply it, then, well, you haven't deserved even the chance to speak it. Maybe it's best to shy away from any kind of situation. And it's what people who feel like frauds and imposters sometimes do. They shy away from opportunities. They don't take risks because, well, any kind of risk that they cannot control is another opportunity for them to be found out.
It creates this sort of either or sort of mentality that I either have to get a 5 or I'm going to be worthless, which means I'm either going to try or I'm not going to try at all for fear of failure.
If you're a teacher of English or another language, you might wonder what you can do to reduce all the stress and help your students cope with the imposter syndrome. Some of the most effective techniques include creating a positive atmosphere in the classroom, combining quality feedback with constant support, and cultivating growth mindset in your students.
In terms of what teachers can do, I think it's important to help those who have imposter syndrome in a few ways. One is to highlight their strengths, because imposters, they tend to look at their weaknesses, magnify them. So sort of draw their attention to their strengths. I remember one of my teachers in the past, she was my supervisor, and she was able to see strengths that I didn't see in myself because I was too worried about taking care of my mistakes and weaknesses. So that's a helpful strategy. And another strategy is to help people have a growth mindset, to help them understand that, okay, you will grow, you will develop, you'll get better at learning this new language. You're just a beginner, and it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to struggle with what you're struggling. For example, if you're a little toddler, you don't expect them to talk in an adult way, and they grow and become an adult over many years. So learning a new language is like that too. And also, I think it would be helpful to normalize their feelings. So those who are learning a new language, those with imposter syndromes, they have a lot of anxiety. They have that fear of being discovered that they're a fraud, and to let them know that this is okay. I understand you have high standards for yourself. You tend to see your weaknesses, and you feel like others won't accept you if they see your weaknesses. But even though it feels that way, but it's more so of a feeling as opposed to a reality. And then the last thing I would suggest is to encourage these people with imposter syndromes to also be okay with their own style. So when we're learning a new language, we try to imitate others who speak well, and we feel like we need to speak that way, we need to present that way. But it becomes very hard because you're not only trying to learn a new language, but you're trying to be someone else that you're not. So I would encourage them to be self-congruent. It's okay. It's about communicating. It's not about talking like this native speaker. And I think that would also be important, and it would relieve some of the pressure and stress.
Stephen Krashen, a linguist and second language acquisition researcher, developed several hypotheses, and one of these hypotheses is the one that is actually related to lowering the anxiety. He calls it, he's still alive, he calls it the affective filter. With the affective filter, he means that if the anxiety is very high in learners, the language learning can be either not so effective or ineffective at all. Yeah. So if the level of anxiety is so high that it can actually just stop altogether any process of learning. And this happens in classrooms and the environments that are not so much supportive of the learner. And if the anxiety is so high that a learner is afraid of making mistakes, if they know that they're going to be punished for the mistakes, either by the teacher or by the parents or by the stakeholders, or if they think that they're going to be laughed at, if the teacher is very, well, I could say it's strict, but strict, and particularly in Russian discourse, it's something good. You know, a strict teacher is a good teacher, which is highly debatable. And I personally I don't agree with that. So if the teacher is a very authoritative and his teaching style is very authoritative, that there is only one right answer and there are all the other answers are wrong, yeah. So this kind of atmosphere that is very tense, this is where actually even among very healthy and motivated individuals, there can be so much anxiety that the learning going to be just ineffective. So what can we do to tackle anxiety? Is exactly the opposite. If a teacher creates a good rapport with their students, or with a rapport we mean a supportive, friendly, open environment, atmosphere, where children or any learners, they are not afraid of asking questions, of debating, agreeing, disagreeing, expressing their opinions safely, not being afraid of being laughed at or being punished or being just saying, oh, you are just wrong. It's not, as I said, whatever, yeah? So if we create this supportive atmosphere that is friendly, that when we see the attitude towards errors as something as a natural state and as a natural stage of the development, because if we take any kind of skills, we know that it's impossible to learn something or anything without making errors. So errors are natural steps or natural side effects, actually, of learning. So if we have this attitude, and if we know that our students feel comfortable, feel relaxed, and if they are striving to grow, then the anxiety lowers. And the same happens if we talk about the use of second language or foreign language out there, yeah, outside of the classroom.
You've got to kind of create a safe space. That's the first thing. And when I say safe space, it's like a kind of classroom where people are not afraid. And in order to do that, first of all, the teacher has to set an example. And I think by doing that, if a teacher wants to come across as being authoritative, in a kind of way of not necessarily abusing their position, but kind of maybe just slightly over exploiting their position of a teacher, that like putting on a kind of facade that I'm the authority here, I know what's right. And again, that can really kind of put people off. And I think if the teacher shows that they are vulnerable as well, and that they do make mistakes, and actually turn it around and pass it to the student, then I think the student would actually feel a sense of comfort and is more likely to participate and more likely to kind of not worry about mistakes. And again, especially like if the student sees others making mistakes and the teacher actually picking up on those in a very constructive and positive way. And I think, again, when it comes to teaching people this error correction, I think a lot of that is mistaught in a way for teachers, because I think, error correction is something where we forget about what slips are. Slips, just ignore them. When you get enough exposure, you'll kind of end up correcting yourself automatically anyway.
Unfortunately, the imposter phenomenon does not spare teachers themselves. They might feel they're bad professionals, they can't plan a good lesson, or even lack skills at the very language they teach. This type of self-doubt can lead to a burnout, so it has to be addressed and treated properly.
The students that I teach have a very distinct profile. Usually they are teachers, because, well, who else needs English at that high levels of, if we talk about advanced and proficiency. And yes, I think indeed some of them can feel a kind of imposter syndrome. I'm not the one who's going to diagnose this in anyhow.
Teachers are not exempt from it, mostly because they not only have to learn the language, but also some pedagogic skills, some methodology, and there are two set of skills at the same time that they have to perform, and it's very easy to feel insecure because there are so many of them.
For a teacher, I think it's a very, very important thing to, when you're being asked a question, for example, about a language, you might not know the answer, or you might think that you know the answer, but this answer proves to be wrong. And I think it's very important to admit that, I was actually misleading you. The answer I gave you was not particularly correct. I Googled it. I looked up in the dictionary. I looked in the grammar book, and actually, and provide them with a correct answer, or more correct answer than it was before. And I think that this is the point where a lot of teachers feel this embarrassment because I'm a teacher. I'm supposed to know everything. No,
yeah.
not. You're not the source of information. Google is the source of information. Books are source of information. Dictionary is a source of information. But you have your own knowledge, your expertise, but it's always limited because we are humans.
Having too little confidence is a hindrance for a language learner. Doubt causes fear, and fear can stop one from further challenging themselves and making actual progress. Paradoxically, having too much confidence is just as detrimental. In this case, people don't challenge themselves either, but the reason for it is directly opposite. When you're already sure that your English is perfect, why bother striving for more? In certain situations, we can speak of a cognitive bias known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, in which people wrongly overestimate their knowledge or competence and underestimate their ignorance.
The Dunning-Kruger effect, it's describing people who overestimate their knowledge or ability. And most likely these people, they lack an accurate sense of awareness. And in other words, these are people who think they're smart, but they don't know what they don't know. So in other words, they don't even have enough knowledge to really get a sense to accurately assess their self-worth or where they're at in terms of their knowledge.
So when we start out in some kind of area, it has been noticed that we feel overconfident, inadequately so, compared to how little we know in the new subject. But it sort of gives us the motivation, gives us the opportunity and confidence to carry on. But on the other hand, it has been noticed that people who are real experts in the field or have spent some time working on some kind of topic or in some kind of area, they feel less confident.
I think imposter syndrome is kind of the opposite. There's a heightened awareness. And I think imposter syndrome, folks think that their competence is low and their success is due to others overestimating their ability. So they feel like a fraud.
Cognitive bias, it's called burden of knowledge, which is a very poetic name for it. So you feel like what you know, everybody knows. The experts feel like what they know is known by everybody else.
You can always maintain, like in my class, I always maintain a very healthy balance. There's a good family atmosphere. Everyone succeeds. It's amazing. But sometimes when I've seen some teachers with some issues and I've offered my help and they've tried it, I spend so much time sort of trying to explain to them, you need to do this, you need to do that. Well, now the ball is in your court. If you're not going to do it, I can't help anymore. I think in the case that when to realize that it's important to be humble and modest rather than be overly confident or even to some degree arrogant about language skills. I just think, I think a lot of that just comes down to self-responsibility and self-maturity. Unfortunately, the only way someone can really get over that is if they've actually spoken about it and admitted that what they're doing is not right. It's kind of like, again, you're getting into the realms here of people say with depression or issues that they're not going to get over it unless they understand that it's a problem. That's the trouble. So they need to kind of talk to people about it.
And this is another flip of the coin, when people are overconfident. And I think that we see that quite a lot, particularly in our kind of social media image life, where you can be a wannabe, when you can present something that is not your real life or not your real expertise. So we see that in masses, people who are, I don't know, just again went to Britain for 2 weeks and then claim that they know English like a native speaker, which is rubbish. And I think that treating these people can be more difficult, but I don't think that these people seek treatment. They think that they know everything and that they are fine and they are absolutely brilliant and so on.
When you come to think of these highly complex feelings, emotions, and cognitive biases, one question arises. How do we navigate our way through all of them? How do you draw the line between bashing ourselves for our own accomplishments and healthy self-criticism?
There's a conundrum upon a conundrum upon a conundrum, like Inception style. Sometimes low self-esteem correlates with imposter syndrome, but not necessarily. Sometimes it could be just a characteristic, just a character trait, indeed, that a person is shy around people. What differentiates, I guess, imposter syndrome, the feeling, those imposter-like feelings, from self-criticism, which could be healthy, is the feeling of shame and guilt. And ideally, you should be able to criticize yourself, to be able to see lapses of judgment or mistakes without feeling this shame and guilt.
The difference between imposter syndrome and low self-esteem is that imposter syndrome, they feel like a fraud. They feel like they'll be discovered. So there's a lot of anxiety around being found out. Low self-esteem, they have a low evaluation of themselves, but it doesn't highlight as much of that anxiety or that fear of being a fraud. And in terms of imposter syndrome and low self-confidence, there's also a difference there too. I think confidence is more refers to what people feel like they can do, they can't do. Fears refers more to like skills. In imposter syndrome, it seems like that imposter is more associated to how people feel about their identity, who they are not. So a little bit different than the skills and ability. And in terms of shyness, I think it's more related to social, just kind of anxiety around interacting with people. And imposter is more like, I'm afraid that I'll be found out, that I'm not this high achieving, high ability person that people think I am.
It has to be said that the term imposter syndrome is becoming a bit of a buzzword. Most work conferences include a talk on the subject. There are hundreds of articles, videos, and podcasts devoted to it, and the more it gets mentioned, the more it gets stripped of its original meaning.
I think that at some point the imposter syndrome has become such a kind of a buzzword, and people like to blame the supposed imposter syndrome for all the things they might have not achieved, lack of motivation, lack of commitment, lack of discipline, and so on and so forth.
On the one hand, it's all those, self-help books and posts and blogs dedicated to imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. All this scope of work is intended to show those people who feel really insecure that they are not alone, that it's rather normal to feel like an imposter, to have this self-doubt.
In my subjective view, it hasn't been that much of a mainstream in SLA, in second language acquisition, and particularly in the psychological aspects of second language acquisition. And I think that's for a reason, because all the discomfort that we associate with language learning, and particularly language speaking, foreign language speaking or second language speaking, is rather defined as language anxiety. Mm-hmm. And under language anxiety, we mean this kind of tension or discomfort. And if we talk about nominally healthy individuals, this is something that can be overcome without any particular special treatment of a psychotherapist or psychologist.
Learning anxiety is primarily characterized by the fear of trying something new, changing the pattern you're used to, or appearing stupid in doing so. There's also xenoglossophobia, known as foreign language anxiety, which presupposes, exactly as it sounds, a fear of learning and speaking a foreign language. The symptoms of both conditions can vary from mild to severe, but may be relieved by applying the same techniques as the ones that have been and will be discussed in this documentary.
And what are you afraid of? Are you afraid someone in your audience will stand up and take a pot shot at you? Are you afraid there'll be a snake on the stage? Or that you will fall off the platform? No, you're afraid of what people will say and think about you as you stand before them. You're afraid of their ridicule. You're afraid they'll see your faults and your shortcomings. Because the thing you're really afraid of is yourself.
Although the imposter syndrome is not a diagnosis per se, as it is not included in the DSM, ICD, or any other acknowledged medical classification, it's imperative that everyone is on the same page regarding the question of getting help. If any of the symptoms associated with the imposter syndrome or language learning anxiety grow out of proportion, become overwhelming and simply unbearable, if you tend to avoid certain situations altogether because of how bad it can get, consulting a professional is the only option. Going into therapy will help you deal with these emotions and minimize their negative impact.
But if we think about imposter syndrome as such in its actual psychological definition, I think that it should first be addressed, or treated, or overcome with the help of a professional. And under professional, I mean here a psychiatrist, not psychiatrist, but psychotherapist, psychotherapist or psychologist, well, depending on the severity of the symptoms. And only then, actually, an individual can be more successful in language learning. Because if there is this condition in this, well, medical meaning, I think that teachers can help only so far.
Well, there's no diagnosis, there's no syndrome. It is not included in any of the classifications as a proper psychiatric diagnosis. But on the other hand, it is a notion, and there are ways to help the individual.
And I think, of course, medical diagnoses, they change over the years. And I think different countries, different contexts might have different medical diagnoses. And imposter syndrome is not an official medical diagnosis in the United States, which is what I'm familiar with. Mm-hmm. But I think it can be a helpful label to interpret certain things and to be aware of how we tend to see ourselves, and also knowing that, okay, we have some characteristics of imposter syndromes might also help us know how to cope with our anxiety or our fear of being exposed, or just that lack of confidence that we can't move forward and do things. So I would see it as a functional aspect. Like if it's helpful and it helps someone know what's happening and know that, okay, this imposter feeling is not reality, I think it might be good. It might help them get a better sense of who they are and how to cope with it. But if it's a label that they say, oh, I'm just an imposter syndrome, so I'm not going to do anything or something, and if it has a negative effect, then probably the label is not helpful.
Well, nothing is set in stone. If you are sort of prone to this imposter feeling, even if you've noticed it in one area, even if you've sort of overcome those feelings, even if you work through them and learned to live with them, not let them subdue you somehow, still in another area, for example, if you have been a successful leader, a successful manager, and you have become a mother, then you might feel like an imposter in your motherhood as well. So you might still feel those imposter-like feelings in other areas of your life. And I guess there's nothing universal, of course, there's nothing uniform, suitable for everybody, but I guess treating yourself with kindness and self-support, self-compassion should be the key. I guess if you have this respect and tenderness and compassion towards yourself, towards those complicated feelings, if you know that deep down inside you are a good person, then it should help you get out of there alive, to seek help, to seek support, not only of yourself, to yourself, but also of other people.
And I've been teaching, well, not just hundreds, but more than 1,000 students that I taught in this context. So that's why I had a lot of different cases that are not so typical. And I did have some students who were so much lacking confidence that they had to give up the course. Yeah, so they were just really several of them on the distance of 10 years probably. Yeah, but these are kind of people where actually after a conversation I advise them to seek some counseling with a psychologist or someone else, because their painful shyness was so strong that they just couldn't feel well in a group, even though the group was very friendly and very supportive.
Imposter syndrome, learning anxiety, language anxiety, perfectionism, low self-esteem, depression, self-doubt. All of these and many more are so closely intertwined and woven into the fabric of our mind, each time forming a unique pattern that it's pretty hard to discern which one is which. So you might ask, do we even need these labels? And the answer is yes and no. No, we don't need another excuse to never do anything, attributing every single mistake and failure to an irresistible force. And we surely don't need to give unsolicited diagnoses to everyone and their mum. What we do need, though, is to be able to give a name to what we feel. Understanding your emotions and reactions is the key to accepting them and dealing with them. Once you've heard something that resonates with you and learned that many other people share the same experiences as you do, you can finally get a grasp on what's going on and devise or adopt some coping strategies that will work for you.
First of all, it's your personality that matters more than anything. If you've got like a shining personality, it doesn't matter how good or bad your English is, people are going to talk to you. They're going to like you no matter what. That's number one. Secondly, the mistakes disappear over time as long as you kind of get constant exposure, and accept the mistakes and learn from them. Then you kind of get better. It just doesn't make any sense to be so caught up in trying to be right, because it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible, because languages are so vast, and I think many people just grossly underestimate how complex languages truly are. The first thing they've got to do is they've got to sort of condition their mindset to think in a different way. So they have to sort of truly understand, okay, let's put things into perspective, like a bit of introspection. Is the world going to explode if I fail? No, it's not. Will everyone hate me, including my family members, if I say instead of the? Of course not.
I think that self-reflection is a very good thing. And in teaching methodology, again, we have a term that is called reflective practitioner. And I think that reflective is the adjective that can be very suitable to any kind of professionalism of expertise. So if you are a professional in any sphere, you should ask yourself regularly, what am I doing? Or why do I feel this way? Yeah. And it's a very useful, actually, psychological trait of people. Like, okay, why were I so angry about this? What was actually the trigger of my anger? This is really hard to teach yourself. Well, unless you were born with that, or you had people around you who actually demonstrated this self-reflective pattern. And by self-reflective, I don't talk about this constant nagging. Oh, maybe I'm not good enough. Oh, maybe I should have chosen another course, or maybe should have chosen another profession. No. Well, that's too much. Yeah. So if we talk about just more or less normal standard situation, I think that people can help themselves if they start asking themselves questions. Why do I lack confidence that much in this group? other people really way ahead of me, or they just are different and I'm different, and you can remember, well, I've graduated from a university. I visited Britain and I was able to talk to British people or whatever. I visited Turkey and I could speak with Turkish people in English and they understood me. So what's wrong actually? And if you are reflective, you can actually lead this kind of inner dialogue to the point where there's nothing wrong with me. I'm fine. If you feel anxious, if you feel lacking confidence, just think about it. Why it's happening? Because almost certainly there's nothing wrong with you, and it's just our mental representations of ourselves or the others that probably do not correspond to the real life.
Your emotions cloud your thinking. When we're feeling anxious, we feel like the world's crumbling and we're not a good person. But in reality, nothing has changed. We're the same person. We're just using the anxiety lens to interpret ourselves.
If it doesn't destroy us internally with those crushing feelings of shame and guilt, of lying to everybody else, of pretending to be someone who you are not actually, then it could motivate us. It could provide some criticism. It could show us where we lack something, where we're still mistaken, and where we could grow. It could provide this fuel.
It's good to be aware and attend to how you're feeling. You don't need to suppress those feelings, but it's like just observing those feelings and being aware of that. And then in those moments, remind yourself of the strengths that you have. That language ability is not just one thing, especially learning a new language. And then remind yourself that, help yourself see that you're magnifying a weakness. I was a second language speaker. So I'm originally from Taiwan. My native language is Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. And so I was in grad school in the United States. And it was challenging to I'm a psychologist. So it was challenging to try to do therapy with Americans and then also feel like I need to talk like Americans. I need to talk like my white, female, 50-year-old supervisors while I'm a 30-year-old Taiwanese man. And it was hard. And I think one of the most helpful things that I learned is that the best version that I can be is genuinely who I am. Mm-hmm. So if I try to be like them, I'll just look awkward because I'm not them. And I can just be the best version of a Taiwanese 30-year-old man that speaks English as a second language. And the importance is about genuineness and communication.
Of course, it's highly individual, but how we experience and how this syndrome or phenomenon manifests itself in different people is kind of different. But what we could begin to do is we could try to notice the feelings and the thoughts and what triggers them, and try to think critically about those ideas, where we got this idea that we are imposters. And we could also try to sort of make a list. Sometimes writing a CV helps, a very extended and detailed, profound CV where you state what you have been doing in this or that position, because it shows us that actually we have been doing something, we did something, we contributed to our work somehow. So maybe our promotion was deserved after all. Another thing that is often suggested is that you could address someone who can relate. You could speak to someone who you trust, like a parent or a friend, a mentor, a colleague, a psychologist. If you could admit to them that you feel like an imposter, you feel like you're out of place, and if they tell you, on the one hand, that they have experienced it themselves, they have been through it, then it may sort of ease this shame of being alone and being a fraud. And on the other hand, they could support you and tell you that, well, truly, you are a remarkable person. You can do this and this and this. And every success and every achievement is truly deserved.
And I think most important is how do we deal with the information that we receive in regards to how good we are, whether it's a criticism or it's an achievement. I think having a growth mindset is important. Knowing that I am not fixed, I can grow, I can learn, I can change. So when we see our mistakes, when we see our weaknesses, it's more like identifying where we can improve, where we can get better at. And in contrast, if someone has a fixed mindset, this is part of Carol Dweck's growth mindset theory. People who have a fixed mindset, they're focused on, they believe that they are who they are, they're not going to change. And they're focused on the current moment, the feedback. And all the feedback are like thermometers measuring how good they are. And so their mood fluctuates. They get criticisms, or they see their weaknesses, and they overgeneralize and think, this is who I am. I'm just a bad person. I'm never going to succeed. I'm a failure. I'm a loser, and things like that. But I think having a growth mindset, it'll help us deal with times when we see our weaknesses. We see it as opportunities to grow.
To sum it up, you could work on the individual level with your own thoughts and ideas, trying to sort of separate from them, trying to notice them, trying to attribute them to this imposter kind of feeling, that it's not the reality, it's what your imposter syndrome tells you. It's what it's trying to convince you that the reality is, but it's not the real reality. And on the other hand, you could find support in other people, in psychological counseling, in reading and educating yourself about this phenomenon. So this could also help. But I guess, well, generally speaking, because it is such a multi-layered, multi-dimensional phenomenon, not only on the individual level, we have to do something about the culture of imposter syndrome, about toxic productivity.
In making this documentary, we've decided to focus on the imposter phenomenon as a combination of imposter-like feelings, lack of confidence, low self-esteem, and magnifying one's own mistakes while downplaying their achievements. The syndrome might have been working against you, but now that you recognize it for what it is, you can actually try and make the best of it. The fake it till you make it mentality could be of help to someone who feels like an imposter. Keep doing what you do like a spy undercover. Try to lure everyone into thinking that you're the best of the best, while knowing you're only human and you're allowed to make mistakes. But you can own up for them and learn from them and grow in the process. And if you walk out of this documentary with just a few thoughts, let them be these ones.
Point number one, you are fine. Yeah, you can make it if you want. And to overcome the shyness, I think that the most important thing, again, is just to remind yourself that people normally are friendly, people won't bite, and people would appreciate you making the effort to speak the language that you're talking to them. And I think that the vast majority of people appreciate that, and they can support you.
I want to say go for it and learn languages, as many as you want. They don't have to be practically applicable. You can learn any kind of language that drives you. From my experience, even if a person tries to gesticulate and knows a couple of words and shows what they mean with their hands, that should be enough for communication. And again, from my experience, most people are very happy when you're trying to learn their language. So even if you do make mistakes, even if your pronunciation is imperfect, that's no matter. The joy is speaking to you, not listening to your perfect pronunciation or perfect grammar. So I would like to say trust the process of speaking and learning and learn to derive pleasure from it. But it's easier said than done, obviously.
I think when we speak in a second language, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're maybe back to this elementary level and to give yourself patience, that you grow and develop and allow yourself time to really learn and not feel like you have to accomplish this in a month, 3 months, or be like a native speaker in a short amount of time. And focus on communicating, and don't be afraid to communicate. Rather than focus on the second language that you don't know yet, the aspect, just acknowledge that it takes courage, and being able to learn a second language is good. It's you're doing additional above and beyond.
There's a famous magician and psychologist called Derren Brown in Britain, and he wrote in one of his books, we spend so much time worrying what people think about us, when in reality, they're not thinking about us at all. We just don't care. Someone invented a pencil with a rubber on the end. Someone invented that for a good reason. Yeah, because people make mistakes. So, and I would say as well, it's just about just really enjoy the process. Just kind of enjoy it. Enjoy this kind of discovery of new language, because it's going to take time. And it's about like delayed gratification. And we say in English, the best things happen to those who wait. So perfectionists and those with imposter syndrome expect results immediately. It's not a healthy way to think. A healthy way to think is, as I said, delayed gratification. It takes time, but the rewards are so much better in the long run. You'll be a much more well-rounded person, more confident, and your English will be better as well. And people will like you more.
So, have you ever experienced any of these imposter-like feelings or self-doubt?
Certainly, it's a very natural thing. I would probably have more questions to people who don't have this.
Of course, I'm not one of those lucky 30%. I don't know how it feels not to feel like an imposter. Yeah, having been brought up in this culture, I guess, I am and as a woman, I'm very prone to feelings like an imposter. And because so as I was saying, there are different sets of skills in teaching, but there are also different sets of skills in my other profession, which is psychology. And it's very easy to feel like an imposter in at least one of them. Yeah, so I am in a very dangerous and a precarious position, I'd say. But I'm learning, as I hope most people will. Let's put it cautiously.
Around teaching, I think when I first became a professor, I was very anxious. I felt like an imposter, definitely like an imposter. I felt like, why did they hire me? Did they not know that my English is not good? I'll sound like a middle school student or elementary school student with my second language English speaking, and students won't perceive me as a professional or an expert. And so I was very worried. And but I think through the process, in terms of teaching my first class, I realized, my care and my passion for the topic and what I impart for them to learn in terms of knowledge overweighed my anxiety in my presentation style. I got very good feedback evaluation, despite I was clearly anxious and I clearly stumbled with my talking.
I still have it now sometimes because I'm a human being. Because the funny thing is, I think what helps me function as a teacher here in Russia is that I'm also a linguist. I trained as a linguist. I speak German and I did a degree in England. And I do remember that I had this kind of feeling very much like many Russians, where I felt I had to be correct. And so even before I spent my year in Germany as a student, I studied all German grammar inside out. I knew it back to front. I knew loads and bits of vocab here and there. When I went to Germany with my other English colleague, he was kind of more happy-go-lucky, more laid back, and he was just more willing to speak. And I realized that he seemed more approachable by Germans than I was. And I thought, well, why is that? And I realized he just seemed to be able to communicate a bit more effectively than me, but he was making loads of mistakes, much more than me. But Germans like talking to him. And I thought, well, why is that? Like, my German's correct. And I spoke to a girl one time who actually gave me the sort of the hard truth. This German girl, and she said, Paul, the thing is, your German's completely correct, but you're so caught up in trying to be right that you don't allow yourself to get out of your comfort zone and play with the German language and experiment with the vocab, where James just doesn't care. He just speaks and he corrects himself automatically, and as a result learns faster. And it was at that very, very moment I realized, yeah, she's right. So I kind of stopped caring so much about being right and realized there's much more to language than being like syntactically and lexically correct.
Yes, I have experienced many imposter syndrome, aware of it. I think learning English as a second language, I think that was an experience. I realized for a period of time, I focus a lot on my presentation, my grammar. Is it perfect? My pronunciation, how people perceive me. But it was through another person who spoke English as a second language as well. And his English was poor, like in terms of grammar and accent. But one day he was presenting at a conference, at a psychology conference, and another person was also presenting. So there's an American that presented well, like very fluent, perfect accent and grammar. And then the Korean person who had incorrect grammar, was slow pace, and accent was a little bit challenging to understand. But I realized I learned a lot from the Korean person who presented in English, and because he had a lot of good content. The American person, in contrast, I didn't remember anything or didn't find anything helpful because it just felt like bluff, like, oh, this and that. So I realized, oh, communication is the key. It's not all about just presenting eloquently. So I think that was helpful. That was one of the turning points in terms of just allowing myself to not have to monitor my grammar after I speak and then go back and correct if I'm wrong, but just focus on communicating with the other person. And I think that took a lot of that unnecessary monitoring away. And then I can just focus on being present and say what I wanted to say.
I mean, I think anyone who says that they haven't doubted themselves is either a fool or a liar.